Welcome, everybody. Today we are going to continue talking about functions in JavaScript. So if you remember from last time, we introduced the concept of a function. We said we'd actually been using them all along. Anytime you see these open close parentheses, that's a function. And we talked about the basics of defining a function in JavaScript, which is to write function, give your function a name, open close parentheses, and then everything inside the function is inside of curly braces. We also talked about the idea of calling functions from other functions, which is a good and normal part of programming, and the idea of a recursion or stack depth, which is how many functions deep we are into a chained series of function calls. So today, we are going to talk about arguments in functions. So, there's this concept in programming called scope. And scope means what context am I in, or another way I like to think about it is what room am I in my program. So you can think of your program as a building that has a bunch of different rooms sort of conceptually, and each one of these functions represents its own room. We talked about functions having an entry and an exit point. And then the sort of overall context of the program is the building or the global scope. So when you declare a variable, when I declare CNV up here, or CTX, or orange tree, the variable lives in a specific scope. JavaScript has 3 scopes, but we're only going to be concerned with 2 of them, global and function scope. And so if I declare the variable outside of a function, which means in my main program, it's got what's called global scope. And that means that anything can see it and anything can change it. So you notice inside of this function onload, I can access my CTX and I can run stuff on it. If I added a function to draw my orange tree, I'd be able to access orange tree. And I could have a function, we're going to get rid of some of these functions, and we're going to create a new variable called, prime number equals 31. Is 31 prime? I think 31's prime. So I could have a function print prime. Yes. And I could say print prime number. I would have to say console.log. We're not in Python anymore, folks. Console.log prime number. So I'm going to call my function print prime. And we are going to save this. And we're going to go ahead and load it up in Chrome. And what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that even though I have declared prime number outside of my function, I can still access it inside of the function. So I'm going to open my file. I'm going to open my index. It's still got the orange tree drawing in there, which is not particularly relevant to this. Oh, and I forgot to actually call my function. I just typed the name of it, which is not going to run it. Calling the function means you have to put in the parentheses. So I'm going to reload, and it's printing out 31. So this function can read my variable prime number. It can also change it. So I am going to say prime number equals 29. I'm going to print prime number inside my function. So we'll add some backticks. This is prime number inside the function. And it's going to print out the prime number in there, not this is prime number. And I'm going to print it out console.log outside of my function. So it's only ever going to print 29, right? Or actually, let's do this. Now it's only ever going to print 29. So what's going to happen is I'm declaring a variable called prime number. And if you remember, functions, they don't get run when they're declared. They just sit around until I actually call them. So it sort of doesn't matter where I put this function. I like to put all mine at the top. So I am going to let my prime number equal 31. I'm going to run print prime, which is going to reassign it to 29. It's going to print out this is 29 inside the function, and then it's going to print out this is 29 outside of my function. And this is really just to demonstrate that if I declare a variable in the global scope, I can work with it anywhere. I can work with it inside of functions. I can work with it in the global scope. I can work with it anywhere. But let's say I moved this variable declaration to inside of my function. So let's say I said let prime number equals 29. Let's see what happens here. let's see what happens with this console.log and the variable prime number. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to reload. And you'll notice that the part of the code that is inside of print prime, this is 29 inside the function, runs correctly. But the part of the code that is outside of the function says that prime number is not defined. And so this is one of the differences between global scope and function scope. When I define a variable inside of a function, that variable only exists for that function. As soon as I enter the function print prime, it creates that variable, and as soon as I exit the function, it gets rid of it. So this is, this is useful when you've got variables that you know you're only going to use in certain contexts. You can define them in the function context, and then they don't even exist outside of that function. Now, they also don't persist, right? So if I was going to call print prime again, it would create another variable called prime number that only exists inside of the scope, has the value of 29, and then evaporates as soon as I leave that room or as soon as I exit that function, depending on how you're thinking about it. So, this sort of presents the question, well, if you're telling me I can call functions from within functions and I define a variable inside of a function, but it's only accessible inside of that function, then all of my variables have to be in the global scope, right? Or else they're not going to exist, they're not going to persist, I'm not going to be able to modify them across functions. And the answer is there is another tool we can use when we're building functions called an argument. And so when I'm defining a function, I can put a list of arguments inside of these parentheses. So you can have an arbitrary number of these. You basically just separate them with commas inside of your parentheses. And I'm going to change this to print numbers. So now this is sort of like declaring the variable and then saying, okay, we also need a value for it that's coming from the function call. So when I call print prime now, or print numbers, which I just renamed, I am going to have to pass in two numbers, or else it won't work. So let me rewrite this function a little bit so that it is actually using the numbers I pass in. And again, when you pass something into a function, when you declare an argument, that's what those are called up here. It's saying this variable exists in the function, and it's going to have a value in it. So I've got to use these values. I'm going to say this is toPrint inside the function. And it's always case sensitive, so you've got to make sure you're actually capitalizing it correctly. This is another number. And we'll separate. We'll add a little bit of text in here that distinguishes these for us. So if I run this code and I get rid of this because it already doesn't work, this is not going to work. So when I reload this, it is passing in these. So I haven't filled these parameters. And so it's telling me that they're undefined, right? This is undefined, because I'm not actually passing anything in. So I've got to put either a number or a variable in here. So I could put in the numbers 12 and 25. And this 12 is going to go into the variable that's named toPrint that gets declared when we enter this function. This 25 is going to go in the variable named another number that gets declared when we enter this function. So if I save this and run it, you'll see those numbers show up inside of my function. So this is 12, this is 25 inside of the function. I can also use a variable as an argument. So I could say let num1 equals 12, let num2 equals 15, and then I could say print numbers num1, num2. And so when I save this and run it, it is going to print out this is 12 and this is 25. And what is happening here is it is taking, when I call this function, print numbers, as soon as it enters the function, it says, okay, we need two variables. We need a variable called toPrint and a variable called another number. And we need to get the values for them from the function call. So it declares toPrint, and it takes the value inside of num1 and puts it in toPrint. And the way it does this is it's just positional. The first position argument goes into the first position parameter. Well, arguments are what it's called when you pass them in. Parameters in the function definition. They're basically interchangeable. Sometimes people call them parameters. Sometimes people call them arguments. But it takes the first argument and puts it in this first declared variable. takes the second argument, num2, and puts it in the second declared variable. And then I have access. This is just like if I said let toPrint equal 12, let another number equal 15, sort of implicitly before I begin my function. Then I have access to those inside of the function. Now, if I do this, so you might say, okay, what happens if I try and change those? So toPrint plus equals 1 is the same thing as saying toPrint equals toPrint plus 1, and another number equals another number plus 1. And then I am going to print these outside of the function as well to see what happens to those variables when I try and change them inside the function. So we're going to save. We are going to reload. And, this is num1 and num2. Num1. You got to remember what you actually name your variables. That helps. Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to reload it. And you'll notice that it doesn't, when I change the value of toPrint and another number, even though I'm passing in num1 and num2, they stay the same, right? So this creates an entirely separate variable that just has the value of these variables when I passed it in. So if I wanted to actually get this out, so let's say I had another function called add 2 num1 and num2. And I want this function to add, I want it to add these two numbers together. So we're going to say the two numbers together are, and let's create a little variable. Let result equals num1 plus num2. This is how you add in JavaScript. We should all know this by now. The two numbers together are result. So I can run this function. I can say add 2, and I want to add 25 and 1 with a bunch of zeros and 1. So this is going to add these two numbers together, and it's going to print out the result, right? I'm going to reload this. It's because, again, we're not in Python. I can't say print. I have to say console.log. Because if I try and say print, that's what it is in Python. If I try and say print, it actually tries to send it to the printer, which is not what I want to do. Okay, so it adds those two numbers together successfully. But let's say I wanted to, I just showed you that I can't really change variables inside of that function. So you might want to think, okay, well, how can I get that result out of the function? There's a couple of different ways. One way is I could just declare a global variable called global result, and we'll say we assign that to 0. And then we're going to change global result to result. And then, because this is declared in the global scope, it's declared in the program scope. So then I could print, or I could console.log, global result, and that's going to print out the same result. So let's go ahead and save this and see that it works. And we're going to reload it. And so it's printing out that number, and it's actually blue because it's a number. This is a string, so it's gray. So that's one way of doing it, but globals are a little bit dangerous because when you declare global variables and you start messing around with them in functions, it's very easy to get into a situation where you don't understand what you're changing where, and so you end up with a bunch of functions and variables that are behaving unpredictably, especially when you get to a larger level of complexity in your programs. So there's a third and last concept I want to cover in functions called a return value. So instead of assigning this to a global result, I can say return. And return means the function is going to throw a value out of it when I leave the function. So the way you use this is you can actually capture the value that the function is returning inside of a variable. So I've got my add to line here, and if I run this, it's actually going to behave the exact same way it did before. I'm not going to catch that return value, but you don't actually have to. So I could also say something like result equals add 2, parentheses 25, comma 1,000, or however many in 1. Let's actually just change this to 1,001 because I'd like to be able to say the number. There we go, 1,001. So this is going to store the value that I return inside of result. And that is the primary way you get information out of functions. So again, it's just going to add them together, but now I can type something like console.log add 2. Console.log result, because I've stored, no, not resize by, because I've stored the value from add 2 into result. So when I save this, it is going to print out the stuff from inside of add 2, and then it's going to print out the 1026 that I stored in result by saying return the value. Okay, so to sort of recap, we've covered 3 important concepts in this video. The first is the concept of scope. Scope means sort of the room or building that you're in. You can think of a program as a building that has a bunch of individual rooms, and those rooms are functions. So when I declare a variable in the global scope, anything can see it and anything can change it. That's like the entire building. When I declare a variable inside of a function, it only exists for as long as I'm in that function, and then it evaporates when I leave that function or when I leave that room. There's two ways of getting information in and out of functions. The way to get it in is by using what's called arguments. You define these by putting them inside of the parentheses in your function definition, and then that creates 2 little variables that get declared as soon as you enter the function that get populated by the values of the parameters you pass in. The other concept is the concept of a return value from a function, and that's basically a value that gets put out of the function when you exit it. So you can capture that in a variable. These don't have to be the same name, by the way. I could call this anything. I could call this a dog variable, and then console.log a dog variable. Variable names are entirely arbitrary. You try and select them so that it's clear what you're doing, but it's basically, and see, this runs exactly the same. This return result means take the function variable called result and return the value. So I can save it in anything. So the 3 concepts, scope, arguments, and return value, are very important. So the skills check for this video is going to be, please build me a function that takes in 2 numbers, and if the numbers are both even, it returns the smallest of the numbers. And if they're either one is even, one is odd, or they're both odd, it returns the largest of the numbers. Well, I'll say that again. The skills check for this video is to write a function that takes in 2 numbers. If both numbers are even, it returns the smallest of the numbers. If either one is odd or both are odd, it returns the largest of the numbers. So if you have any questions, any concerns, raise your hand. I will take a look at it. Otherwise, good luck with the skills check, and you are ready to move on to the next video after you finish it.